Now, as promised, the news in detail. Our top story begins in the UK with Boris Johnson, who will take office as that country's Prime Minister today, following an audience with Queen Elizabeth. Over 92,000 party members chose Johnson as the Tory leader on Tuesday. Theresa May will formally submit her resignation as Prime Minister at Buckingham Palace. The new Conservative leader will address the nation for the first time outside 10 Downing Street. Johnson is expected to announce senior cabinet posts, including Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary. The new Tory leader said his diverse top team will reflect a modern Britain. Meanwhile, the EU has warned Johnson of challenging times, saying the Brexit deal will not be renegotiated. Well, to discuss that further, we're now joined by Jonathan Fryer, who is the Brexit spokesperson for the Liberal Democrat Party. Jonathan, as always, thanks for joining us. What are the major challenges, Jonathan, do you think that Boris Johnson will face as Prime Minister, especially, of course, related to Brexit?
Well, there are really two major challenges which he himself identified in the speech he made when he accepted his election result yesterday. The first, as you've mentioned, is Brexit. He has said very clearly he intends to deliver Brexit with or without a deal by October the 31st, and that Britain will leave the EU on the 31st of October. But the EU, as you mentioned, has said they are not prepared to renegotiate the so-called withdrawal agreement, which Theresa May had with the EU officials, and moreover the Parliament is not ready to allow Britain to crash out of the EU without a deal. So the Brexit problem is a huge conundrum. But the second thing, which he also mentioned yesterday, was he said he is going to unite the country, and in some respects, that's going to be even more difficult because Britain, since the EU referendum in 2016, is deeply divided, not just between Remainers and Leavers, but increasingly ideologically as well. And we see increasing demonstrations in the streets, quite angry confrontation, and social media in this country has become a bear pit of people tearing at each other and their different political ideas. So it's a very, very challenging time for Boris Johnson to be taking over.
Now, obviously, for all of us outside the country, Jonathan, foreign policies, does this new Prime Minister plan to bring any changes, do you think, to the UK's foreign policy?
I don't think we will see many major changes, for example, in the confrontation with Iran in the Gulf at the moment, where Britain is trying to be independent of the United States and to try to find a way of de-escalating the situation. However, Boris Johnson is very close to the American President, Donald Trump, and what I think is bound to happen is that we will be less in contact with our European allies, such as France and Germany, and much more dealing with the Americans, including, of course, the hoped-for trade deal, because one of the ways of trying to mitigate the disaster or the economic hit that we're going to get from leaving the EU, particularly without a deal, is we will need to boost trade with other countries. And Donald Trump has said very clearly that he would like this to be an opportunity for Britain to get closer to the United States. And he has effectively endorsed Boris Johnson. He did that even before Boris Johnson was elected by the Conservative Party members.
And then, Jonathan, very if you can, as a final thought, how would you compare then the leadership style of Boris Johnson and now ex-Prime Minister Theresa May?
They're two completely different characters. Theresa May is rather introspective. She didn't really consult with many people around, had a very small group of advisors, and was very cut off from her own MPs, let alone the rest of Parliament. Whereas Boris Johnson is an outgoing, some might even say bumptious personality, fond of jokes, fond of making fun of situations. So he may have to temper his personality because it's not going to work as Prime Minister. Didn't really work as Foreign Secretary, to be honest.
Very well, Jonathan, we'll leave that. But of course, we do appreciate your time and for sharing your thoughts with us here at Indus News. Now moving on to Tehran, which says it is ready for just negotiations, but not if they mean surrender. President Hassan Rouhani said Iran is completely ready for legal and honest negotiations to solve all problems. Rouhani appreciated the country's mediating a way forward over the 2015 nuclear deal. But he threatened scaling further back from the accord's commitments if Sunday's negotiations with remaining signatories fail. He warned the U.S. against violating Tehran's airspace. Earlier, Iran's state media said Britain has sent a mediator to Tehran to negotiate the release of its seized oil tanker. The Swedish-based operator of the tanker, Stena Impero, said they have been in contact with the crew members. It said all 23 crew members of the crew are safe. Now, in a related development, Russia has proposed a Gulf Security Organization to consolidate political and diplomatic efforts. The Foreign Ministry said the group would hold an international conference on security and cooperation in the Gulf. Moscow said the organization will be tasked with the implementation of a plan of action to normalize the security situation. The plan will also seek to settle conflicts and outline parameters of a future post-crisis system for the region. Meanwhile, France, Italy, and Denmark have announced their support for Britain's Strait of Hormuz naval mission. Britain initiated that plan after its Stena Impero oil tanker was captured by Iranian commandos near the Strait of Hormuz. Moreover, Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Sayed Abbas Araghchi is in Paris to discuss ways of saving the 2015 nuclear deal. This comes ahead of a planned meeting of the accord's signatories in Vienna on Sunday. Tehran said Araghchi delivered a message from President Hassan Rouhani to the French President Emmanuel Macron. He also met French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian. In a statement, the French Foreign Ministry asked Iran to take steps to reduce tensions in the Gulf. Paris has been trying to broker de-escalation talks between Tehran and Washington for more than a month. In other news now, Syria says its air defenses foiled Israeli airstrikes on military bases in Daraa province. State media said the strike was directed at Tel Hara Hill near the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. It said 2 soldiers were wounded in the air raids. Syria and Iran warned Israel of retaliatory attacks after Israel targeted the same area last month. Meanwhile, government forces continue to pound rebel positions in northwestern Syria with airstrikes. War monitors say 6 people were killed in Aleppo yesterday, while 3 rebel fighters were killed south of Idlib. Well, the UN says the war in Yemen can be stopped because warring sides still support a peace deal brokered in Stockholm last December. The 4-year-long war between the Yemen government and Houthi rebels has killed tens of thousands and has left millions on the brink of famine. UN envoy Martin Griffiths said both parties want a political solution. He added there was no military solution to the problem. He said warring sides remain committed to all aspects of the Stockholm Agreement. The international community has also supported that agreement. Griffiths said talks have made progress, but several issues remain unresolved, including port revenue and local security. Moving on, China says the U.S. is undermining global strategic stability by selling arms to Taiwan. In a white paper, the Chinese Defense Ministry said separatist forces pose the gravest threat to peace in the Taiwan Strait. It said Beijing will pursue a policy that is defensive in nature, but will use force if necessary. Earlier, the U.S. State Department approved over $2 billion in arms sales to Taiwan. The white paper also said China will complete the modernization of its military by 2035. It said China has reduced army personnel by 300,000 to keep the total active force at 2 million. The paper said growing hegemonism, unilateralism, and constant regional conflicts are disturbing international security. Earlier, China had accused U.S. officials of purporting violent protests in Hong Kong and advised them to remove their hands from the territory. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying said the U.S. should stop sending the wrong signals through illegal acts in the region. On to Europe now, where France's lower house of parliament has approved a huge trade deal between the European Union and Canada with a small majority. 266 votes were cast in favor and 213 against the agreement. The EU-Canada trade deal was ratified after a heated debate on its environmental impact and opposition by some ruling party members. The comprehensive economic and trade agreement took preliminary effect in September 2017, but it must also be approved by all 28 EU member states to become permanent. The legislation in France will now head to the Senate before being signed into law by President Emmanuel Macron. The trade deal removes tariffs on nearly all goods and services between Canada and Europe. It will lead to a 15% increase in EU exports to Canada. Climate activist Greta Thunberg, in a thumping speech, has slammed her critics in the French parliament. The Swedish teenager dismissed the hate and threats by far-right politicians. Thunberg took on her critics, saying her organization, the Fridays for Future, only highlights the risk of climate change. The 16-year-old asked legislators to unite behind the science of global warming. She accused politicians, businessmen, and journalists of failing to communicate the scientific truth and leaving the burden to children.
I believe that the biggest danger is not our inaction. The real danger is when companies and politicians are making it look like real action is happening, when in fact almost nothing is being done, apart from clever accounting and creative PR.
Thunberg's movement calls on students around the world to protest for more ambitious efforts to fight climate change. Well, in related news, the EU climate watchdog has issued a warning ahead of another spell of extremely hot weather. The UN also cautioned that the new heat wave would aggravate droughts in France and the risk of fires in Spain. Russia has denied it apologized to South Korea over alleged airspace violation. Russia's defense ministry said it conducted the first joint long-range air patrol with China on Tuesday. Earlier, South Korea's presidential office said Russia blamed an equipment malfunction for an aircraft intrusion into its airspace. South Korea claimed its warplanes chased away the aircraft after firing over 300 warning shots. On the same day, Japan's military also said it scrambled fighter jets to intercept Russian and Chinese planes. Time now for a break. I'll be back, though, after the break with plenty more news. Stay tuned. Let's begin this segment of the Bulletin in South Korea. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton has arrived in Seoul to discuss a number of pressing regional and global issues. This comes after Russia and China's first joint air patrol unsettled U.S. allies in the region. Bolton met South Korea's Defense Minister Jeong Kyung-do amid escalating regional tensions. During the meeting, the two sides discussed stalled nuclear talks with North Korea and the regional airspace dispute. The ongoing trade dispute between Seoul and Tokyo over wartime forced labor was also discussed. Bolton will also meet National Security Chief Chung Yu-yong and Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa later in the day. Elsewhere, Mexico says it will not hold further discussions with Washington over a safe third country status for asylum seekers. An agreement on the proposal would push asylum seekers apprehended at the U.S. border to seek refuge in Mexico. Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard said the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in recent talks did not address a deal on asylum seekers. The June 7th deal was reached to avert President Donald Trump's threat of increasing U.S. tariffs on all Mexican products. The foreign minister said he told Pompeo the proposal is unnecessary after Mexico helped reduce border detentions. Mexico has long resisted U.S. pressure to formally accept the safe third country status. It agreed to begin talks on the move if by July 22nd, the U.S. considered it had not done enough to check the flow of migrants. Well, South Africa is notorious for high rates of violent crime. A group of young journalists is trying to fight back with their own radio show.
The topic of the day is the role of policy and how you can influence gun laws.
Jennifer Ngubeni is not just another radio announcer. She produces and co-hosts a radio show on Alex FM with other teenagers. They talk about gun violence and its effects on their lives. Alexandra Township, which borders South Africa's richest square mile, Sandton, is one of the roughest and most violent suburbs of Johannesburg.
With gun violence, it's something that people in Alexandra have tend to normalize, which is not a good thing. So us talking about gun violence actually helps make people realize and makes them gain conscious that it's not okay for someone to be killed with a gun.
According to Gun Free South Africa, between 18 and 21 people are killed by firearms every day in the country. Marianne, an activist for the organization, trains these young journalists. She teaches them how to target gun violence through their reporting.
Alexandra has a history of violence, and it's, some people call Alexandra Gomorrah, and that's not something one can be proud of. I mean, why are we being compared to Gomorrah?
Every week, Jennifer and her peers take to the streets of Alexandra and speak to people affected by crime in the community. These interviews are at the center of the 1-hour Saturday program, supported by Children's Radio Foundation and Gun Free South Africa.
We're only killing our society by keeping quiet about certain issues, and us talking about them, we're influencing other young people that your voice matters.
Since 2014, over 50 young journalists have been involved in the program called Bigger Than Life. As they continue to mobilize for gun-free zones in their communities, the skills they learn today could see them becoming the next big names in radio or advocacy in the future.
Rare footage of Brazil's uncontacted Awa Amazon tribe has emerged. Awa is one of the world's most threatened tribes, a community that wishes to remain isolated in the forest. The video was recorded by neighboring Guajajara tribe to raise awareness about the Awa's plight. The footage shows a man holding a large knife, looking towards the person filming him. The video also indicates the presence of other tribesmen. It is being forced to move due to the presence of illegal loggers, miners, and drug traffickers in their territory. In the Czech Republic, daredevils balanced and walked mid-air on lines tied between rock formations at a slackline festival in the north.
Slacklining is a precise art. It involves walking on a strap suspended in air and tied between two anchor points. Czech Republic has an entire festival dedicated to the sport. Some 200 people from over 40 countries gather to walk to and fro and occasionally jump up and down the lines.
It's so simple. You're just walking, and you got to focus on just that, and you're just being in that space. It's a really nice feeling.
Some said the act of levitating mid-air feels natural to them.
I started slacklining when I was 18, like 3 years ago, and it was because some friends that I was living with were doing it, and I just thought it was really fun, a nice practice for me. I'd never really done any other sport, but it felt really natural for me. I like being a monkey, so it was really good.
The festival is for both amateurs and skilled slackliners. It is one of the few slackline festivals which take place in different parts of Europe.
Let's begin with South Korea, which has asked Japan to abandon its plan of imposing trade restrictions. Last week, Japan had threatened to drop South Korea from a list of countries facing minimum curbs under its trade control law. Industry Minister Sung Yun-mo said South Korea's removal from Japan's trading whitelist is against international norms. He called on Japan to remove recently imposed curbs on tech exports to South Korea. He said further Japanese trade restrictions will undermine its economic and security partnership with South Korea. Well, Asian stock markets have nudged higher amid optimism over next week's trade talks between China and the U.S. Mainland Chinese shares and Japan's Nikkei have edged up. Hong Kong's Hang Seng and Australia's ASX 200 are trading fractionally higher. But in South Korea, the Kospi has returned to negative territory because of rising trade tensions with Japan. In Europe, the FTSE 100 declined for the first time in 3 days. The dollar hit 2-month highs against the euro as investors await tomorrow's European Central Bank meeting on interest rates. Oil prices have risen in Asian trading. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. And you're all caught up. That is all for this edition of the World News here at Indus.